This podcast is part of the Big Heads Media Podcast Network. Go to bigheadsmedia.com for more great podcasts.
Welcome to the BiCurean podcast, where we explore and embrace the seeming contradictions of life. What actually is BiCurean, you ask?
While you may not necessarily have a mental concept of BiCurean, partially maybe because it's a made-up word, you embody it. What's happening right now in terms of the divisions between us is a focus on that which is different.
And lack of understanding and empathy for people's beliefs is no longer an excuse.
And it is in the differences we carry in ourselves that we find the BiCurean moment.
When you really dig into something, you're going to see some depth to it. It's not just a race thing. It's not just a conservation thing.
It's letting go of the or to make room for the and. We embrace all of you. Welcome to the BiCurean.
Hello, welcome to the BiCurean podcast. I am Aisala.
And I am Eric.
And this week, I am really excited to introduce our guest. As we shared a couple weeks ago, we joined the Big Heads Media Podcast Network, and I started listening to one of the other shows and was very excited about what they were doing and was lucky enough to meet Alex Hollingsworth, who is our guest today. So welcome to the show, Alex. And if you could tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and your show, we'd love that.
Sure. Well, Alicia and Eric, thank you for having me on. So my background, I'm a business owner and I'm a banker. I've been in finance for 17 years. I worked my way up all the way from a teller in banking to a vice president at a number of different banks. And so my background is in finance. And then podcasting, interestingly enough, as part of the Big Heads Media Network, I'm one of the co-hosts for Off the Record. So Off the Record is a podcast on society and culture from a Black male perspective. And we cover everything from politics to marriage to mental health to everything in between. We cover myself, Brandon, Mike, and Quan. And so it's our brainchild. And then what actually started me in podcasting was the Laker Central podcast, which I founded 2 years ago. I'm a huge Los Angeles Laker fan. And so that's what got me in the podcasting. And then we launched Off the Record, and here we are.
It's a really great show.
Yeah, we highly recommend it here. And when we heard about what you were doing and listened to it as we were exploring our brothers and sisters on the Big Heads Media Network, you really caught our attention. And so
thank you.
And so you mentioned your background in finance, and that was actually one of the show I was listening to. You were talking a little bit about the different ways in which wealth was and median income was varied between families. Often one of the aspects is obviously race. Mm-hmm. And it was just really interesting what you were talking about. And so we thought, well, let's do a show that kind of talks about the racial wealth gap and a little bit about what that is and why people care. I mean,
well, it's a big deal to me because number one, full disclosure, I'm a Black man. So
okay.
When we talk about
that's fair.
Always worth mentioning on radio.
Yeah,
it is. And so when we talk about inequality, it's near and dear to my heart because I've experienced it. My wife has experienced it. She's a Black woman. My parents, so on and so forth. So I'm fully aware of the inequalities in this country. And so on Off the Record, we haven't done a full episode on it yet, but we've touched on topics around it. And so we end up kind of weaving in topics on inequality. But it seems to be, for some reason, it's a hot button topic in America. And it's almost like it's a taboo topic where universities, politicians, I mean, there are studies done by everybody on, okay, there's a problem here, right? What seems to end up happening is, how do we fix that problem? You know, people have different ideas, but we just keep going on in this big circle. And we've been in this circle for the last easily since the civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. Not much has changed. And in fact, financially, things have gotten worse for people of color, specifically Black people, despite advances in education, jobs. Like I said, I've been a vice president at a bunch of huge banks. Despite those advances, we haven't made enough across the board.
Right. Well, and so interestingly, I think that one of the things that I think has brought it up to the front front and center in modern politics is there's a real awareness that a lot of the social issues that we face would be fixed by socioeconomic equality. Like that economic justice is a core part of why we have a lot of the violence and a lot of the like isms, if you will, that affect people in a larger way. And there seems to be this, like when you talk about like the racial wealth gap, one of the things that's interesting to me is that a lot of like business owners, especially business owners who have been privileged by the institutions and don't really get it, they don't see that privilege. They have this idea that like their work doesn't matter, or that like that, you know, and the reality is that, you know, we're all working really hard. Maybe not all of us, but we'll just let's give it. Let's say everybody's working really hard, and it's hard to explain to somebody with privilege, or, you know, we need to come up with a new word because I don't think people even hear that anymore, that it's not that we're saying you aren't working. It's that your work gets you further more quickly, more easily than the work that somebody else is doing who maybe doesn't have those same privileges that you have, that are, you know, just inherent in how this all goes. So, you know, I don't really know how that, but it's been interesting to see that conversation come up. I think Bernie Sanders kicked it off in 2016, but a bunch of people have really taken it. There are tons of modern news articles and legitimate magazines talking about this stuff again. So
I think that's so. The word privilege, it's kind of like diversity and inclusion. We talk about it so much now, and so it's important for anyone to recognize what privilege they have, right? And so, I'm a man, so in this country, men have privileges that women don't. Even if things are quote unquote equal, there are things that I'm allowed to do that if a woman did it, she would be looked at a different way or maybe frowned upon. And so I recognize that privilege, and it's important for anyone else to, right? When I think about privilege, I was thinking about this today, and we talk about bootstrapping, which is a term I hate. I hate bootstrapping, because there's this idea that like you just work hard and you can achieve this American dream, but it's hard to bootstrap when you don't even have the boots, right? And
yeah,
I mean,
fair.
like, and there's a whole lot of people that don't even have the boots, and so Kylie Jenner. Everyone knows Kylie Jenner. They know who her family is. They know her sisters, right? She was on a magazine cover not too long ago. She was dubbed as, I think she might be either the youngest billionaire or something, because she just sold one of her cosmetic lines. And people dubbed her as being this self-made youngest billionaire, and that she worked hard. And what I'm getting ready to say is not something that would take away from the work that she's done, because obviously she's done some work or she wouldn't have gotten to where she got to. But her privilege comes in the fact that, one, she's white. Two, her sisters were already super famous, and her father is super famous. You know, at least was in the 70s and 80s. He's an Olympian. He's maybe famous now for different reasons than he was back then. But there's a privilege that she was able to launch her company on, that if I tried to do that, I wouldn't have that opportunity. At least the opportunity to fail, try again, fail, try again, right? So there's a difference in that kind of self-made than what most of us have. We talk about Jeff Bezos. I don't know if he's still the richest man in the world since his divorce, but at one point he was worth over,
That's fair.
he was worth over $100 billion at one point, right? And people talk about what he's done with Amazon, and I love Amazon. I order stuff there way too much. It's ridiculous. But one of the ways Bezos was able to start his company was his parents gave him $250,000 initially to help start it.
Yeah.
I don't know anybody black that's even well off that can give their kids $250,000 to start a company, right?
Yeah.
Like $5,000 to start a company. So not $250,000 is a long way from $100 billion, but there's privilege in having parents that can give that to you and say, go try.
Right.
And if you fail, that $250,000 doesn't cost us our retirement. You know what I'm saying? And I don't think that people quite realize who has that privilege and who doesn't, because it makes them look in the mirror and they say, well, I still worked hard. I don't want you to take away from the fact that I went to school where I worked my way up from a low level position. And it's not to do that, but it's just to recognize you had help that maybe some of us don't have.
Yeah.
I think that's really the point. And I've tried to explain what privilege is to people, and you kind of nailed it. But the key understanding that people miss on that is that they might look at Bezos and say, well, I got 250,000. That's just, it's, life's not fair. I didn't get that. Yes, but that's the acknowledgement, right? In what ways is life more fair for you? Maybe maybe you're white and a man and you still didn't have somebody to give you $250,000. You say it's not fair, but what privileges do you have that maybe are
Right.
not as dramatic as that? And yeah, I agree with you completely on the bootstrapping thing. That annoys me because yes, everybody has the capability of working hard, and trust me, I know plenty of people who have not worked hard, and not gotten ahead, right alongside a lot of friends and family that have worked hard. But it's where you're starting from. Like, what floor are you? Are you 2 floors in the basement? Are
That's the
you on
point.
0? Did you
That's
start on the 13th floor? Like, where are you when
Yeah.
you start?
Well, and I just listened to a podcast. I love The Hidden Brain. I don't know if you're familiar with them.
Mm.
And one of the episodes that I just listened to was really well timed. It's called Zip Code Destiny, because they did studies on, people. I didn't know about this. I want to say they said it was in the 80s, but there was a movement. I think it was when they were doing busing, additionally, to help people in poverty they could apply for the ability to be moved to a better neighborhood, like their whole family. And it was income based, I think. But and so then they studied those families. And what was interesting was that during the time when they moved the families, not much changed. Like the families didn't really, they moved to the suburbs or they moved to a better neighborhood with less crime. But what they found was that their children, if their children were under 13 before they moved, they did a follow-up, in the last decade, that those kids were more likely to have completed college. They were making significantly more money than the kids from their neighborhoods. And then, and they were talking about this, the zip code destiny is also incarceration rates. And you bring up, like, when you're talking about being a Black man, and you probably already know this, but I'm going to share this for our listeners, which is that Black men have the lowest likelihood of upward mobility of any population. Even Black women compared to Black women are not the same disparity as Black men to white men. And Black men are more likely to lose their upwardness. Like white men, they said they compare it kind of to like white men are on a treadmill, and they tend to be more likely to go up and to stay on the treadmill, and Black men are less likely to go up. And if they do go up, they're more likely to slip back, or their children are more likely to slip back. And they said that, and then in the zip code destiny, they were talking about a lot of the research on that and showing that, like, they took these 2 population zip codes in California, and one of them, the incarceration rates for the Black men was something like 46%. Like, it was horrible. And they said, but moving them to a zip code 5 miles away reduced it to 6%. And they're like, that's not good. Let's not say that's good, but it's better.
Yeah.
And it's something, and just, it was an interesting thing. And obviously we can't move people. You can't move the whole country from a bad neighborhood to the good neighborhood or whatever it is. However, moving some of those children who are then tied to those neighborhoods, who might be able to bring those communities forward while also working on institutional fixes, there's some hope, right? Like, maybe we could try.
You're right. And so much, it's funny you said, bring those people forward, right? Like, for me, I grew up in Frederick, Maryland for the first 15 years of my life. Frederick County, which is a suburb in Maryland. And, after that, then I lived in Howard County. Well, Howard County is the second wealthiest county in Maryland. And so as a Black man, there are privileges with me growing up where I got to grow up at, right? I didn't grow up in the Black areas of Maryland. I grew up in the white areas of Maryland. And there are privileges with that. Zip codes, as you mentioned. My mom was a vice president for a really long time in HR. And she told me how, she would see applicants come across the different people that reported to her. And if they lived in a certain zip code, they would move on past their application. And so there are all kinds of ways in which discrimination is kind of played around with people. It's not always just someone calling you, a name to your face or something like that. It's all kinds of ways that people are held back. And for me, so many people that look like me have to also pull their families up.
Yeah.
Whether you're a first time graduate or first time making it, in a company, first time homeowner, whatever it is, you know, you're often pulling your family with you.
Mhm.
So like when my wife and I, we got married, um, you know, we paid for our wedding on our own. We bought our house on our own. We paid for our wedding on our own. Um, that's different from some of, our white friends and coworkers who their dad gave them $10,000 as a wedding gift, helped
Yeah.
them buy their first home, or they own some property or own some land from a grandparent that was left to them, right? Like it's so different. And I feel like in this country, there's this idea that you work hard and anyone can achieve anything. And oh, look, we had a black president. Well, I mean, oh, look, now we have an idiot in office, right? Look at the swing after that first black president was elected.
It does
Like,
feel like there was a pendulum swing.
It really
doesn't it?
does.
right? And, and while this is a little off topic, I tell people all the time, sure, we had a black president, but when a white woman who was clearly qualified for the office ran, she lost to a dude that has no business running anything in this country.
Yeah.
Right? Like look at how so I say those things to just say that there are things that we have to face that I feel like people don't want to acknowledge. And I faced it myself. As I mentioned, vice president in banking. I was in an officers meeting one time, and it was so crazy. I was in this officers meeting. Everyone that was a VP or higher, and we had our board of directors there and our senior management. Senior management, literally all these men, white men, gray hair, like 60 years old, and someone passed the question to the front and asked, when were you all going to have some color or women in leadership positions? And it shocked the person, the CEO that was up there shocked him. And he kind of turned it into a joke.
Mhm.
And he said, well, we're old. We're going to die off sometime soon. And then, there's Reggie. Look, Reggie was one of the black VPs. Reggie's in the front row. He'll end up. And I just felt like, one, it's not a joke. And two, you need to recognize that your company is very diverse. And if management all looks one way, that doesn't speak well for the company as far as I'm concerned. And it's just something I think people want to gloss over. I've written a number of papers on this because I'm a sociology major. And one of the things that I found that there are 23, of all the Fortune 500 companies, only 23 of them are led by women or people of color. 500 companies and only 23 are led by women or people of color.
Mm-hmm.
That's ridiculous, right?
Yep.
I mean, so you have to ask, well, why is that? And I even recognize that my level, there are a number of people that look like I do, but the level after mine, there's almost nobody that looks like me.
Yeah.
And you start just asking the question, why is that? And I think this country, America has simply never dealt with slavery.
Mhm.
America does not want to deal with slavery. America wants to act like that happened so long ago that it doesn't impact anybody, but it still does.
Yeah.
It's an interesting story. I happen to be a judge at there was this nonprofit in DC that was they had women there pitching business ideas, and I was one of the judges on the panel. But one of the other judges, he and we had lunch, and I found out that one of his grandfathers was Thomas Jefferson, and his other grandfather was the gentleman that donated the land that Florida State University was built on.
Huh.
And we're telling our background, our stories, and I'm just like, when your grandfathers accumulated that kind of wealth, mine were in shackles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of your grandfathers could have easily have owned one of mine. So the head start that you got to have, you shouldn't just gloss over that. Like Usain Bolt is the fastest man on the planet, but if you give me a 4-track head start, I can beat him in a race too.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter how hard he runs. And I think we just gloss over those things.
No, it's all a very good point. And we've talked about various different things in diversity. One of the things that we're very active in is specific LGBT things. And the reality is that in that world, you're likely to still be a white man. You're going to suffer from these same sort of, you're diverse, but for a different reason. And so much of this comes down to how you look.
Yes.
So, and I think that's where part of the problem really comes into our mentality is, and it's not helping to have the president that we have right now, because he's pointing out the inferiority in his eyes of various different shades of brown, right? So
Yep.
it's, it's so counterproductive in that anytime he says something and there's white supremacist groups that are like cheering for it, I'm like, no, we're moving backwards right now. We're nowhere. We're definitely not closer to getting people to stop seeing the issues that we have, in diversity. We're bringing them to the forefront in a negative way.
Yeah.
And that's what we need to really get to before people will even hear the word privilege and understand that, social programs or just our own awareness, diversity in the workplace that's not about filling quotas, but actually about, looking for different ways of thinking that might come from different ethnicities.
Yes.
We need to be there, but it's hard to get there right now.
I'm glad you brought up the LGBTQ community, because there's something that I feel like that I've said to people around me is that, look, if let's say, for example, you happen to be a gay white man, to your point, you're still a white man, right? And you can quote unquote hide your sexuality or your sexual preference. Not that you should have to, but you have the ability to do so.
Yeah.
I'm not hiding this skin that I have on right now.
Yeah.
There's nothing I can do. When I walk out, everyone sees exactly who and what I am.
Yeah.
And so that in itself for that person is a privilege for them, because they can hide who they are if they need to do that to get up the corporate ladder. But I can't do that. And I think it all just comes down to, one, recognizing your privilege, which I think is very difficult for anybody to do, but also just to recognize, like I've had people say to me, well, Jewish people faced discrimination or faced it. Irish people did. Germans did. And they came to this country and they worked their way up. Yeah, but they didn't come here in chains. Nobody else did.
Yeah.
And when Jewish people faced discrimination in Germany with the Holocaust, someone came and rescued them and then carved out land for them. No one came and rescued African Americans or Africans and said, we're going to fight America and then give you guys a country.
Right.
No one did that.
No.
We were just kind of left to our own devices once Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation.
Yeah. Well, and I'm really glad you brought that up, because actually the situation with the Holocaust is the Germans paid reparations. They paid, like England had, so it's questionable morality, right? Because, England had this land in the Middle East that they had taken from people that they gave to the Jewish people, which maybe that there's some challenges with that.
It has fundamentally not been smooth. Can we just admit?
No, it has
And
not,
so-
right? They're still fighting.
They're still fighting because they gave something they didn't own away,
Right.
which,
That's right.
and they still acknowledge, like, the Jewish people need their own land. Maybe they should have given something that belonged to them for real, but okay. And even a few years ago, Germany re-upped reparations money for elders who went through the Holocaust to pay for them. It was it says there's like 56,000 more people who survived, who suffered, and they're covering some of their care. And most people will acknowledge that that's the right thing to do. They'll say, you know what, they tortured people, they killed them, they just ripped their families apart, they stole their property, like all of that. 100%. and so we can see it when it comes to the Second World War and when it comes to the Jewish population. And I'll tell you, like, interestingly for me, when I think about, how we talk about slavery, one thing is, when we talk about it in the school, it's always, we learn about it as something that happened a long time ago, right? Mm-hmm. And we don't actually talk about the social implications of what happened, what we did. And, I've heard arguments like African tribes at the time would have, their tribal conflicts. And one of the things that they did in those conflicts was take slaves. But there is a tribal cultural process around it. There was more dignity to it, just like the Vikings also had slaves. But once again, their slaves could earn their freedom. There was a dignity to it because it wasn't an othering of those people. It was they were a part of the community, even though they were, in a certain way, they were reparations for the tribal warfare, right? But then there was a process, whereas when the white people started either just capturing Africans or buying them from tribes, because I don't think that necessarily the tribes knew what was going to happen to them.
That's right.
They might not have been willing to make the trade if they had understood like what they were sending people into. But there's that argument that I think is something to acknowledge, and to also acknowledge just the cultural difference to it. But we don't really talk about, like, in our school system, you have to do a sociology major. I mean, if you're not a Black person, I'm sure that's a different experience. But I mean, from a larger mainstream cultural perspective and from a white perspective, I didn't learn it from school. I learned it from going out and getting exposed to new ideas
Right.
because of my curiosity about the world. Nobody hands it to you. So that's one of the barriers we have to even solving the problem, is that a large portion of the population doesn't even understand why there's something to talk about.
It's in this country, it just feels like we gloss over slavery. And Germany, as far as I understand, has owned up to the damages of the Holocaust. And to your point, they've done reparations. Like in Germany, you don't hear about people having a Nazi flag in their front yard, but right down the street from where I live, people have Confederate flags in their front yard. Right, I drive past them all the time going to work, and it's just like, you guys lost, right? Like, what are you doing?
It's a really disgusting Southern pride thing. Like, that's what they've tried to turn it into. But of course, like what that means to somebody like you or even me who just does not agree with their philosophy is like, it's dividing, it's divisive right off the bat.
It's so ridiculous that is, that's kind of festered. And I'm not someone that thinks that you just throw away history. I think that is a part of history, but it has its place, not flying in someone's front yard where you can throw it up in my face, right? I think that's ridiculous. So in DC, not far from where I live, they have the African American History Museum that opened up a couple years ago. So what's really interesting for me is when I drive past that museum, it sits in the shadow of the Washington Monument, and I'm very critical of presidents in this country. Like George Washington is celebrated, but he owned over 173 slaves.
Yeah.
And when he went to Philadelphia, slavery was outlawed. And so in Philly, you had to get rid of your slaves within 6 months. So what he would do is he went to Philly, and then he would keep a slave for 6 months, send them back to Mount Vernon, and then get another slave or another batch of slaves. So he would get around that particular law. And so to me, a president being crooked didn't start with Trump. It started from the very beginning of this country. But we don't talk about those things, right? He celebrated because he won the war. Fine. But he's got a really, really bad background because he owned slaves. The same thing with Lincoln. Lincoln did sign the Emancipation Proclamation, but Lincoln wrestled with freeing slaves, and Lincoln wanted to send the slaves back to Africa. So it wasn't as if he did it as this, my morals are getting to me, it's the right thing to do. I also think that Lincoln freed the slaves because it was a way to cripple the South for the North to win the war.
It was a strategy, absolutely.
Right. There's all these ways that you need to look at this and not gloss over it. And I growing up as a black person, I hear about all these things, and I lived with my grandparents for the first 15 years of my life. And so they were born in the 30s. So they faced discrimination in a way that I can't imagine what it was like. So I got to hear those stories. And even when I was growing up, there were white kids that would call me the N-word, and I would end up fighting all the time in school. And then my grandmother would have to come up to the school and then talk to the principal, and then the kid's parent would come in there. But it was just like, if you feel that comfortable saying it to me, that means you're getting it from somewhere. So maybe you're hearing it at home, right? And so for me, it's always been, if I have to deal with these things and I have to look in the mirror every day and see what this country has done to my ancestors and to some degree what it still does to me, everybody else should feel that too, and not act like just because we had a black president or just because Oprah is a billionaire or just because we have all these other symbols of equal treatment, that things are equal, of equality, because it's still not equal.
Well, there's a myth, I think, among a lot of people that we all have the same shot. And we're harping on this idea of privilege and stuff, but it's that myth that needs to go away. And
yes,
and the idea that you won't have a different experience walking down the street, man, especially in a southernish state where, they're going to fly that flag and things like that. Like, I think most people, if they actually understood what kind of an experience you'd have, but they don't want to.
No, they don't.
They want to ignore that sort of thing. And that's where the education thing, I'm, if you listen back on some of the shows, you'll hear I kind of go off on this stuff. I've been very upset at the Democratic Party for a couple of reasons. And one of the things that I think caused this pendulum swing as it has right now is that when we've had power in the past and when we've been out pushing this agenda of, fighting hate and things like that,
Yeah.
we've done it from a stance of like, you have to be tolerant, you have to do this. We never educated, we never actually explained to people why. We just said it's not cool and you have to change, and people don't like to be told things like that. We need to change the narrative to it being about, why would you want anyone to have a bad time? Why would you want anyone to not have a fair chance, especially if it's not something that has to cost you anything more than your awareness to maybe pay attention to the interactions you're having? Your privilege is not something you need to be punished for, but why don't you use it in a positive way?
Well, I think you hit it on the head. I did think people really do feel like if a black person or anybody else that's a minority gets a job or gets to buy a home, somehow you're taking something away from them.
Yeah, you didn't lose anything.
Yeah.
Right. And I, how can I say this? Like,
To say it straight. Don't worry about it.
well, look, the country owes us something. And by us, I mean black people, because without black people, this country is not built. I drive past the Washington Monument all the time, and that was built by slaves. The White House was built by slaves. We are certainly owed something. Now, how do you quantify what we're owed? There are too many bright people in this country to say that they don't know how. Like, you can't just say you don't know how to figure this out. Can certainly figure it out. But there's this thing where if we were to do reparations here, well, who pays for it? It takes away from some working class, white male in the South. Well, look, we already have socialism built into capitalism. People are just ignoring what that socialism is. And so you want to say, well, someone that is on social programs where they're kind of draining America and draining America's capitalism and reserves. Well, what do you think the wealthy are doing? Like, I'm in finance, and I look at someone being on, food stamps the same way I look at someone getting a tax cut. It's the wealthy that gets a tax cut is socialism, and that same person that is on social programs, that's socialism as well. It's just, well, who's paying for it, right? And so my thing is, why would you want someone to have less than you? Why would you want someone to not have at least the same opportunity?
Right.
And I think so many people are just hung up on, you're going to take something out of my hands.
Yeah.
And that's not the case.
It's really not.
Yeah.
I want to share. So we're talking about this, and I want to just share. It's a long, but there's some facts that I think would be helpful, right? So, and like I said, you probably all know this. It's a little bit for our listeners, but until the 13th Amendment, slavery legally prevented blacks from building wealth in this country. So they first of all, they started out 100 years about behind everybody else. Until the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Jim Crow laws continued segregation in the South. They detailed what jobs blacks could take, how much they could be paid, and they created a certain amount of almost an indentured servitude. They restricted where blacks lived and traveled, zip code destiny. Public parks, transportation, and restaurants were segregated, and some towns were even off limits to blacks. The laws were violently enforced by the Ku Klux Klan and lynchings. Between 1880 and 1950, white mobs lynched blacks at least once a week for some perceived breach of the racial hierarchy. Once a week, people were taught that. Most lynchings took place in small southern towns where poor white farmers perceived blacks as an economic threat. In 1935, the Social Security Act excluded farm workers and domestic workers from accruing benefits. At that time, most blacks still lived in the South and were illiterate, which meant they were more likely to be farm workers and domestic workers. As a result, 2/3 of blacks never received Social Security's wealth-building opportunities, which also created an achievement gap. A McKinsey study found that it's cost the U.S. economy more than all recessions since the 1970s. If there had been no achievement gap in the years between 1998 and 2008, U.S. gross domestic product would have been $525 billion higher in 2008. Similarly, if low-income students had the same educational achievement as their wealthier peers over that same period, they would have added another $670 billion in GDP. So not only does the country owe the black community something, the country actually owes the whole country something, because we've actually damaged ourselves.
I agree.
And I'm not saying we shouldn't do it because it's right. I just don't know necessarily that I believe people will do things because they're right. If they don't understand, there's something in it for them. Our country would see, and most economists agree, that we would see either a small to huge bump in our GDP if we were to do some form of investment in reparations, whether they're atonement reparations, which is like building opportunity for Black people, or more of a looking back reparations, which is trying to give them some value of what they should have gotten. Everybody would benefit.
No, you're right. And you mentioned that farm bill in 1935, but in 1930, with FDR's New Deal, I mean, FDR's New Deal established Social Security, established a lot of things that we champion today, right?
Yeah.
But one of the things it did was within that New Deal, only not, I believe I'm looking at this right now. So when the government was giving out home loans as part of FDR's New Deal in the 1930s, only 2% went to Black people. 98% of all home loans in the 30s went to white Americans, right? And with home ownership being at the core of how strong you are financially, that's another setback for us, for people of color, for my grandparents that grew up during that time period, right? Like, you can't just ignore these things. And people talk about slavery, well, 16, 17, 1800s. Well, this is in the 1930s.
Yep.
I mean, so, and that there are people, my grandfather's still alive. There are people that experienced this that had to figure out a way to overcome discrimination, not just out in the streets, but by their own government.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I don't know how you just gloss over that.
Well, and this, I think, is the fundamental problem, is that there was the civil rights movement, and there is this idea that fixed it all, or that it created more opportunity, or it leveled the playing field in some way. And that's where we are on 50 years on, still trying to educate people that that's just not what actually happened.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's not. I mean, look, the civil rights movement did a lot of good things that I benefit from today. But the reality of it is, every time that laws are passed to enforce equality, there are other laws passed to not enforce equality.
Yep.
That seems to happen. And if the federal government passes a law, then there's some states out there passing other laws, right? Or if the federal government passes a law, then the next administration comes in and they're passing something that kind of undoes some of what was done in that. So we've been on this like this hamster wheel, and we're never going to get past it if people don't acknowledge that that some people are benefiting from some of these things, but overall, you're hurting the country. To your point, Alicia, you're ultimately hurting the country when you're holding back any segment of the population from being able to achieve financial wealth. And in my world, in finance and banking, we do things like financial literacy. And I like financial literacy, but I bet the listeners didn't know that Black people on average actually save 10% more than white people.
Probably not.
Yet, right. Yet we don't have near the wealth that white Americans have, right? Because we don't have the incomes, and we don't have houses being passed down, or 401ks being passed down, or retirement. We don't have these things. We're always starting from scratch. And so we're just in this loop, and I'm 38 years old. I don't even know if we'll get out of it in my lifetime. I just feel like we're just going back and forth, back and forth.
Well, so one of the things that we like to do on this show is kind of end on a note of, even if we're just being idealistic, what could you see recommending, that somebody who's listening to this could carry with them to start making a difference tomorrow, even if it's small?
I don't know. So I don't even know what someone as an individual can do. So it's like something I think about. So when you give money to an organization, that's a tax write-off. I've always wondered, if I give money to an organization like the Red Cross, as an example, and then the government gives me a tax credit, it's kind of like, well, why is the government incenting me to do what's right? Like, they're just basically giving me that money back, or a portion of that money back. Like, give without expecting something in return. So oftentimes when I donate to different nonprofits, I don't file that on my taxes, because I don't need to be incented to do what I think is right. I also think that it's important for people who are in positions of power, so specifically white people, to look. It helps to have people from different backgrounds that don't look like you and sound like you in the room because you can get a wide range of ideas. It's important to hire people who are outside the box, outside of your normal box. So, you know, maybe you belong to a country club and there's someone that they have a son that's graduating college and they want to get him in that position. Okay, I understand why people hire folks that they're familiar with, but maybe hire someone that's from a completely different place from you. I think that oftentimes when people are in positions of power, they end up hiring or promoting people that look and sound like they do.
Yep.
And there's this glass ceiling that we hit, and to some degree, I've hit that glass ceiling. I do well, but I realize that how much higher can I get if someone won't look beyond what I look like? You know what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yep.
It's just hard to tell somebody what to do. I've got some really grand ideas, but the country doesn't want to hear what I have to say on that.
Oh, we do. But maybe we should do another follow-up.
I'd be happy
I'd
to
love
have you
that.
back on in the future. We have a slew of guests from various different backgrounds and experiences, and as our podcast is maturing, like visiting certain topics with people and getting their perspective on it is something we want to do. So it's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for
I'm-
taking the time to be on the show with us.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, and like I said, we look forward to having you back on. So, thanks.
Thanks. Have a good day.
You too.
Support for BiCurean comes from Manscaped, who is the best in men's below-the-belt grooming. Manscaped offers precision-engineered tools for your family jewels. Jingle balls to the walls, fellas. Listen up. Untrimmed pubes are a thing of the past. It's time to gear up and get yourself the gift of shaving this holiday season. And I am talking about the Manscaped Perfect Package 2.0. I've been a cyclist my entire life, and one of the things that I have had to do is shave everything. Not sure if it helps with aerodynamics, but it definitely helps with comfort. Unless you're nicked up and have all sorts of razor burn, there's all kinds of problems that are going to come up. And that's why this revolutionary company, Manscaped, has redesigned the electric trimmer. Their Lawnmower 2.0 has proprietary advanced skin-safe technology, so the trimmer will not nick or snag on your bits. It's also waterproof, so you can use it in the shower. The Lawnmower 2.0 comes inside their Perfect Package 2.0, which makes the perfect gift this holiday season. It's literally everything you need to keep trimmed, cut-free, and smelling nice down there. And don't use the same trimmer on your face as you would on your balls. That's just nasty. The Manscaped Perfect Package 2.0 also includes the Crop Preserver, an anti-chafing ball deodorant and moisturizer. You already put deodorant on your armpits. Why not put deodorant on the smelliest part of your body? And yes, your balls stink. Speaking of sweaty and stinky balls, I am so thankful for their Crop Reviver. This product, along with their Crop Preserver, keep your balls from sweating, smelling, and sticking. And these products smell good. Their manly scent is attractive and will help set the mood, if you know what I mean. The Perfect Package will also come with a pair of Manscaped boxer briefs that'll keep your junk feeling fresh all day. It's time to upgrade those overused pair of boxers to Manscaped's high-performance anti-chafing boxer briefs. 'Tis the season of Manscaped, so get yourself, your dad, your brother, and your friends the best gift of all, the Manscaped Perfect Package 2.0. And for a limited time, you can get 20% off and free shipping with the code BIGHEADS at manscaped.com. I promise your balls will thank you. Welcome to the BiCurean moment.
Hi, I am very excited. Mine is a fun little light BiCurean moment.
Okay, mine's not as light, but
So I'll go.
do you first.
So I wanted to talk about Long Shot, a movie that I saw. I really enjoyed it. And one of the things that I liked about it is that it really worked to get beyond the partisan approach to things. So I'm just going to recommend it. It interestingly didn't get good reviews. And when I was reading the reviews, I think it's because honestly, people sort of like the partisan fight in a certain way. And so the people that were reviewing it and saying they didn't really like it were kind of saying, yeah, it was a little bit too in the middle. But I actually didn't find that to be the case. So I'll be curious if you watch it.
Yeah,
I
I'd
thought it
like
was
to
fun.
see it after, based on what you said. It
Yeah.
sounded like it was interesting.
And I'm going to put a link to there's a scene in it when one of the characters comes out as Republican, and it was really quite hilarious. So I'm gonna put that either on Facebook or something like that.
Yeah. No, it sounds like an interesting one. I definitely want to check it out.
Yeah.
So, my BiCurean moment, is sort of related to what we were talking about, and it's something I've been thinking about a lot more recently, which is what does diversity actually mean, especially like diversity in the workplace? And it occurred to me that I think fundamentally people throw that word around and just think that they want maybe a group office photo to not look whitewashed. And achieving a couple of people of color or different ethnicities and toss a few women in there and now you're diverse. But it really needs to be more than that. And I've been really just contemplating the idea of what different ethnicities can bring to a company. Even something as simple as, hiring people from different ethnicities and hearing their ideas and how your company can interact with people of those descents. What does that actually mean? Or are you actually opening up ways to market a product to a whole new group because you have that perspective actually on staff and it's not just stats that your marketing people are reading? Do you understand the plights of various different people because you actually have the experience of being able to share those experiences with people on a day-to-day basis?
Mhm.
Diversity should be about diversity of ideas and what people from different ethnic backgrounds and genders can bring to things, not just checking the box of making sure that you have a certain amount of diversity just based on skin color or gender. So just something to think about.
Yeah, no, I like that. We often think about diversity from the perspective of what things look like, and obviously, from our conversation with Alex, that is something to consider. In terms of people feeling a sense of looking around and feeling they aren't isolated. And there's so much more to it than the picture. There's a depth to it that we also really want to see invited in, because that combination of depth and support, I guess, is going to be what's really going to make the changes that we all want to see.
Yeah, absolutely.
cool.
So, I'd like to say thanks for listening. If you have ideas, feedback, thoughts, please find us on social media. We are BiCurean on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Or you can give us a call at 720-507-7309. And our email is podcast@BiCurean.com.
And if you like what we are doing, consider supporting us on glow.fm/BiCurean, or rate us on your listening platform of choice.
Thank you.